Hi everyone and welcome. I'm joined today by Alexander Mercouris and Paul Robinson, Professor of International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. And yeah, we're meeting today to discuss one of his most recent books, which is on Russian liberalism as a very important topic relating to Russia, and I would say also in the West. As you point out, even in your introduction, we are seeing a crisis, if you will, and at least we're talking about a crisis in liberalism in the world. And often a lot of these discussions can also be related back to the discussions we've had in the past in Russia. Anyways, I thought perhaps we could start with defining liberalism and the role it's had in Russia. To start with a very wide question.
Yeah, that's it's much easier said than done. I've now written a book on conservatism and one on liberalism, and I think the main conclusion in my mind I've drawn is these are very bad terms, which probably hide more than they reveal. But particularly because what is meant by liberalism has changed significantly over the decades, so that some people who are described as liberals now are in direct conflict with what are called classical liberals, who adhere to what liberalism originally meant. So it's very, very hard to determine exactly what this thing is. There's one author I quoted, Duncan Bell, who in a study on what is liberalism said, well, it's basically whatever people who are called liberals say it is. But I think you can try and talk maybe not of liberalism, but of liberalisms, plural, which were sort of related group of ideas, which have certain things in common, but not all, so you can identify certain features which are present in many liberalisms, and some are present in one liberalism and not another, and they form a sort of family of related ideologies, which are founded at the center of which is the idea of the person or the individual, and of the need and desire to promote the interests and dignity of the person. But then, of course, that's also arguably innate in many religions, for instance, not necessarily liberalism. But liberalism has a particular sort of set of values and institutions which it associates with the proper development of the individual, and those would be things, values such as liberty, equality, would be the most obvious, and then institutions such as freedom of speech, democracy, free markets in particular. I know those are the most sort of classical things, but different actors within the liberal family will put more value on one than on the other. So you could be a economic liberal but not be a political liberal, and you could be a political liberal and not be an economic liberal, right? So in Russia there's often been what we call liberal authoritarianism. So that's not classical liberalism. It's its own sort of nuance. And in Russia there's a particular problem because liberalism has become very associated with Westernism. So being a liberal tends to mean believing that Russia is a European country, that its destiny is in Europe, and that its history is moving inexorably towards Western-style liberal democracy, and therefore Russia must copy whatever is the most advanced form of Western fashion at the time, in essence. Now, you don't need to be a Westernizer to be a liberal, and a liberal might not be a Westernizer, and a Westernizer might not be a liberal, but that's unusual in a Russian context. Generally speaking, Westernizers are liberals and liberals are Westernizers, not exclusively, but and that creates certain problems, of course, for Russian liberalism because it is so closely associated with this idea of Westernism.
Well, can I say, first of all, that I thought that you've just written a wonderful book. You wrote a wonderful book on conservatism. And I think this book on liberalism is also, in Russia, is also extremely interesting. And I'm just going to mention a few of my main takeaways about this. First of all, liberalism, both Russian imperial liberalism and Soviet and post-Soviet liberalism are Russian phenomenon. They're not imports into Russia that have been inserted by the West. I think a lot of people think that, but they are events, they're movements that have stemmed from Russian political economic conditions, and they reflect those conditions. The second is that there is a very long history of politically liberal attitudes. And I think your point about placing specific values on individuals, on individual rights, is perhaps, for me, looking at all of this, the key uniting thread, the sense that there is a specific value on the individual. It may be in the exercise of political rights, of personal rights, of economic rights. This, as you correctly said, varies from time to time. But anyway, there are periods when liberal attitudes can have quite a lot of traction within Russian governments. But periods when there are specific liberal political movements in Russia up to now have been fairly confined in time. So reading your book, it seemed to me, for example, that there's a very long period in 19th century Russia where you get various officials, some very senior officials, people like Speransky, the Milyutins, other people in universities, people like Professor Granovsky, I probably get his name wrong, but people like this who have strongly liberal attitudes and liberal perspectives. But I didn't get the sense then that there is a specific liberal political movement. And then suddenly, and I do think it's quite sudden, this is my impression from reading the book, it suddenly bursts, it develops into a specific political force sometime around 1890. And it remains very strong right up until the revolution. And then it goes into emigration, and then it sort of fades away. And then something rather similar happens in the Soviet Union, in that, again, you have people who have liberal attitudes or liberal perspectives who start to emerge. Sometimes they're very influential. They influence the Kosygin reforms in the 1960s. They're close to, or they're involved in some ways with Yuri Andropov within the Soviet bureaucracy and the Soviet system. But a concrete liberal political movement, again, only starts to emerge perhaps after the 1968 events. You mentioned the Prague Spring, perhaps just to add myself, the Daniil and Sinyavsky trials in the Soviet Union. And then there's, again, a sudden emergence of liberal ideas, liberal thinking, and it starts to develop some kind of political form. And it gains force until the 1990s, when, again, it contracts. And I'm going to suggest that one of the things that makes this happen is that there's a sudden moment of revelation on the part of people who are inclined towards some sort of liberal ideas or liberal attitudes, that the government, which up to that point maybe they have not been exactly hostile to, is not going to evolve in the liberal directions that they want. So in the 1890s, there's the period of Alexander III's clampdown and Nicholas II's clampdown. In the late 1960s, early 1970s, there's the Prague Spring, the action against the Daniil and Sinyavsky, people of that kind. And that sort of triggers a kind of reaction. And at that point, you start to get a kind of liberal perspective form. And in both cases, the interesting thing about this process is that once this liberal movement in both cases starts to develop, over a certain period of time, it becomes radicalized. And where previously it had shown some interest in working with the existing government, it ultimately becomes implacably hostile to it and effectively seeks its overthrow. Now, is this an oversimplification? Is this, I mean, these are takeaways from my book. I'm not suggesting that, this is the correct view, but reading this, this is what I felt, that liberalism does exist in Russia. The attitudes precede the movements, and the movements are in some respects a reaction to what the state, to what the government actually does.
I think that's not a bad description. I mean, both liberalism and conservatism can be described as attitudes as much as political movements, and certainly in Russia, liberal political movements have nearly always been weak. What you have had, and liberal change when it's happened in Russia, has generally happened due to one in the 19th century called enlightened bureaucrats. And the same could be said again for the Gorbachev era. It's these people, they're not really liberals. You mentioned Speransky and Milutin. We're not really liberals, but they're people who sense that the state of things are not good, and that something has to change in order to move things forward. So in the case of the Milutins, you have defeat in the Crimean War, which then leads a lot of people to say, look, things got to change, right? Some liberalization is necessary. And similarly, under Gorbachev, there's this sort of attitude, well, things have got to change. If we liberalize things will get better. Now, of course, it doesn't work out that way, because once they start liberalizing things begin to go off the rails fairly rapidly, as it turns out. And then you get this radicalization you spoke about does happen. And so there's sort of, you might say, two strands in Russian liberalism. There's the statist strand, which is supportive of the state and believes in the state can be the liberalizing force, such as, Alexander II freeing the serfs, right? So you have to support the state because the state is the force for reform. And then you have the people who say, no, this state is reactionary. It's got to go. And they become, outright revolutionaries, which is pretty much what happens around 1905, when, the Liberal Party is not, well, according to some critics, it ceases to be a liberal party, like the cadets and so on, because they've basically allied with revolutionary forces. And I mean, you could see a similar process, in contemporary Russia, where, there are, for many years, what were called, systemic opposition or systemic liberals, those who've worked within the Russian state, and there are still a few. Not many, but there are some huddled within the echelons of the sort of economic apparatus of the Russian state and the central bank and the finance ministry and so on, who still seek to work within the system. But most have moved into not only opposition, but of course almost revolutionary opposition. But the Putin regime, as they call it, must be overthrown, right? So this radicalization then takes place, at which point people say, some historians say, well, are they still liberals at that point? Because liberalism is generally associated with sort of gradualism. So you can have a very conservative liberalism, which believes in the state as the mover of reform, but you can also have a very revolutionary liberalism as well. And both of these aspects have existed side by side in Russian history.
Well, it seems like a lot of this goes back to your original argument why liberalism comes in many forms, because of course, on one hand you have it's a lot of it would be focused on the role of the government, and me and Alexander discussed this in the past as well, which is in the early 19th century a lot of liberals saw, for example, market liberalism as being a source of economic independence from the state, so a way of reducing the role of the state as a form of classical liberalism. Well, at the end of the 19th century, you had more liberals looking towards the state as a partner or ally in terms of reducing some of the power of the market forces, especially the larger oligarchies. And you also have the same within the within the state and the individual. Often you have liberalism seeking to advance the individual. You see this often perhaps reducing the influence of culture, traditions, the family, or the group essentially as an entity. But then if you have more radical individualism, then this less balances to the state. That is, the state would have more influence over the individual if all the other centers of powers, if it was weakened. So it is a difficult, yes, to nail down.
It's very complicated.
Yeah,
and
complicated is a good word.
In for instance, in 19th century Russia, because you get, for instance, after the great reforms of the 1860s, you get what's called the aristocratic opposition, where you get these big landowners who say, well, you know what, really we need to get rid of, now we got rid of serfdom, we need to change everything. Nothing works anymore. But the state's out to get us. So we need representative government. And we need to, liberate the peasant commune. Eliminate the peasant commune and go to free market relations in the countryside. So in many ways, they're classical liberals, but they're doing this because they know very well that, they will dominate any representative government because, it's probably going to be a property franchise and the rich people will be in charge. And then they know that free market relations in the countryside will consolidate, their economic power. So the liberals, or the people who are called liberals, are against all these things. So, no, we can't have representative government because then these reactionaries will be in charge, and we really can't have free market in the countryside because then the peasants will be, will be exploited, and that will be terrible, and then revolutionary problems. So then you have to, well, who's the real liberal now? Is it because the people espousing classical liberalism are people who everyone sort of agrees are reactionary, and the people who are liberals are saying, no, we've got to keep the peasant commune, and we've got to, capitalism is bad, and we should have an autocratic state. So it all gets really complicated. So you can have sort of part of liberalism, but not another part. And you can see similar things in later times. So when the Soviet Union is collapsing, you get people like Anatoly Chubais, famous member of Yeltsin's government. He wrote this piece in just the final couple of years of the Soviet Union, saying, well, you need to do this radical economic reform, but if you have democracy, the people are going to hate it, and they're going to vote against it, right? So you're going to have to use undemocratic methods in order to have this, to bring democracy almost, So when you say, well, are these guys really liberals or we're not? It gets complicated.
I have to say, I found the whole business in the book about the aristocratic opposition wanting to get representative institutions and radical reforms in the countryside absolutely fascinating. And this reminded me, I have to say, of long ago, when I was studying at university French 18th century history. There's even something of that there. You have liberals at that time, the encyclopedists and people like that, they're talking about personal liberties, about reason, enlightenment, and all that kind of thing. And the people who are advocating at that time for representative institutions, or at least for a role in government, are in fact the aristocracy, basically because they're unhappy about paying taxes. And the liberals, or proto-liberals, not really liberals at that time, they actually tend, if anything, to support the state, the king, because they think he's the person who's going to carry out all of those reforms. Anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked.
Yeah, but also, I mean, the French Revolution was largely a reaction to free market reforms carried out by, I've forgotten what the name of those particular strand.
Necker, the physiocrats, all of that.
I had a bunch of free market economists as finance minister, and everyone hated them. right? And that was very, very much what it was a reaction to. So, it's tricky, and it's very easy to bracket people into these things, liberal, conservative, whatever. But as I study this more and more, I think we probably need a new language of political philosophy, because we have these sort of 19th century terms which perhaps are not desperately meaningful anymore.
I'm sure that's right. But coming back to the point of the Russians, the other thing is they don't just become radicalized and authoritarian. There's also a tendency to actually support violence, either violence against the government in the period running up to the revolution, or when the revolution happens and it all goes wrong, some of them talk about violence to reimpose order. And there's this lady member of the cadet party who says, that she wants machine guns, that, we have to have order.
Williams, she was married to an Englishman.
Well, exactly. So there we go. And then coming more recently, there's I think there's the post-Soviet liberal who says, that he sees a group of elderly pensioners protesting, and he wants to machine gun them too. That I don't know whether one should make too many parallels, but there is a kind of radicalization which does seem to me to feel that you've got to impose controls and do this in very violent ways, and which contradicts and ultimately, I suspect, discredits the entire liberal ethos that these people have previously promoted. So that one of the reasons for the crisis of liberalism in Russia is precisely because they started to turn to these very things. At least that was my own impression.
Yeah, well, it is often associated with a very strong dislike of perceived enemies.
Yeah.
Now, before the revolution, it wasn't that liberals supported violence. I think generally they disliked revolutionary violence, but they weren't willing to condemn it.
Yeah.
Because they hated the government more, right? And to condemn the terrorism would mean saying that, Stolypin was right to hang the terrorists, and they were not willing to do that, even though, this meant that the state would have nothing to do with them. So the cadet Stolypin actually offered to legalize the cadet party, which was never formally registered as a party. And he said, look, we'll allow you to register as a party if you just say, we condemn revolutionary terrorism. And they said, we're not going to do it. And then, of course, later when they're in exile, they start writing these things. Vasily Maklakov, famous, member of the Cadet Party, writes these sort of things. Well, I think we got that one wrong. It turned out that the people weren't so nice after all, and the revolution. There was this naivety that terrorism was all founded on hatred of the government. So if you could overthrow the government, then there'd be no reason for everyone to be radical and communist anymore. They just all become liberals like you. And then they sort of realized that actually, no, this is not true. And suddenly you have people like Arianna Williams saying, yeah, we need machine guns because the masses are a black mass of evilness. And so you have like almost two objects of distrust. The first object of distrust is the state, which must be overthrown. The second object of distrust is the people, because the liberals, eventually, and they still do, come to the recognition that the people don't support them, and that, and therefore, they come to the conclusion that the people are backward, they're uneducated, they need. It's the job of us liberals, of course, to bring them to enlightenment. But in the meantime, we need to keep a firm control over them. But of course, by being against the state, you then destroy the thing which does have firm control over the people, and then that creates some difficulties for them.
This is a bit similar to some of the arguments from John Stuart Mill. He was making a similar argument that the people, the masses, don't always know what's good for them. So democracy is not. It's not. It can be the wind in the sail of liberalism, but at times when the masses, he argued, could be stupid, the liberal elites would have to rule and ignore them. But I'm curious though if Russia has. If the introduction of liberalism in Russia has more of a violent root, because in your book you point at some point that many in Russia would consider the introduction of liberalism to have started to some extent, of course some before, but in 1825 with this Decembrist revolt, because then you had former not former, but Russian military who had defeated Napoleon. They came back from France. They brought their ideas with them. And how do you advance liberalism in Russia? Is it by bottom up through these ideas? No, they instead try to instigate a coup, so a revolution toppling the government based on foreign ideas, remaking it almost in the image of France. So it takes very anti-government position immediately. It's also conflates liberalism with Westernization. Again, throwing away organic Russian ideas with foreign, where it almost becomes treasonous. And this, I use the word treasonous because this is almost a label liberals end up with in Russia. If you want to look at Boris Yeltsin's foreign minister, for example, Andrei Kozyrev, he's now, imagine foreign minister, he takes on a American citizenship, he moves to Miami, and now he spends his time on Twitter calling for killing Russian soldiers in Ukraine. I mean, it's quite like this has almost become the stereotype of liberals in many circles in Russia. Now, this is not a smear against liberalism, but this idea that the liberal is a pro-Western and against the Russian state, one that's not capable of working within the political system in Russia, because you see a lot of other political parties seems to have been brought into the fold. So you have from the left to the right, they can even work with communists within the system, but the liberals kind of haven't really found their place within Russia. Sometimes it seems.
No, I don't think they have. I mean, there's an interesting quote I have from one person who says, Russia's tragedy is people who value freedom don't like tradition, and people who value tradition don't like freedom. so liberals who value freedom at the same time too often are perceived, rightly or wrongly, to not like Russia very much, right? And people who then declare themselves as patriots, on the other hand, don't seem to like freedom very much. And Russia has perhaps never been able to find what you might call a sort of national liberalism, which is able to, on the one hand, take some degree of pride in Russian national traditions, and at the same time, promote individual freedom, and or at least it has failed to convince the Russian people that it does. Now, so Russian liberals to this day, I mean, and from the Decembrists onwards, would say that they are the true patriots, that the state is destroying the country. The state is reactionary and oppressing the people, that in opposing the state, they are therefore patriotic people, right? Because you cannot love your country and permit it to be ruled by a regime which is leading it to disaster. The problem is, this is of course does, as you say, very easy, bring you very close to a sort of line where opposition turns into treason, right? And then certainly in the case of Decembrists, you when you're trying to kill the Tsar, you've obviously crossed that line. And you have it in 1905 when members of the Cadet Party are openly pro-Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War. They don't actually collaborate with the Japanese, but they make it very clear that they want the Japanese to win. They don't cross the line into treason because they never actually do anything about it. It's just sort of very writing articles underground, going, "Yay Japan!" That's about as far as they take it. But still, the sentiment is there. And in today, of course, you will have some liberals who simply say they're opposed to the war in Ukraine, but of course there'll be others who have gone a step further and actively support Ukraine and actively support measures being taken against Russia. And at that point, you're crossing the line again, right? And then everyone gets tainted with that accusation, and as a result, it's always been this, rightly or wrongly, there has been a perpetual perception that liberals lack patriotic feeling. That's not necessarily true. We saw that in the First World War, when liberals were very gung-ho. But nonetheless, that perception persists. It's used by Russian rulers to undermine liberals, and they don't have a very good response to it, because it's a line which works very well, and also because liberalism in Russia, and this is another point I think I should mention, has what I guess communists would call a narrow social base. So it's tended to lack strong roots outside, basically outside intellectuals, outside people who use their brains to earn their living. So the Cadet Party around 1905, it was called a party of professors because it was. Over 50% of its central committee were university professors, and those who weren't were lawyers and doctors. Right? And nowadays, liberalism in Russia is associated with what people call, the creative classes. So it'd be journalists, IT professionals, people like that. But what the communists would have called workers and peasants, have simply never been in the membership of the movement at all, really. And that again cements this idea that this is some force which simply doesn't understand the people and isn't in touch with the people and is alien to the people, even hostile to the people. That may not be fair, but that's the perception people have, and it's very ruinous to liberalism's political prospects.
Is that partly because of this focus on the West? That I mean, it goes beyond the subject of your book, but just a possible question: is it because they look always to the West? They're very, very keen on Russia becoming, European. I mean, not all of them, but this seems to be the sort of predominant view, that they want Russia to be European. They want it to be Western. They see Britain, France, the United States nowadays as the ideal that one must achieve. So that instead of looking around them, looking at what goes on in factories and farms and mines and in all of these sort of places and the kind of lives that people have in housing estates and all of those places, that they're more focused, they're too much focused on what's going on outside in other places, and that if they perhaps thought rather less about the West and more about the immediate problems around them, that might change. Because one of the most interesting things that I found, again at the very end of your book, is that you mentioned things that Russians do like, and a lot of the things that they like are things, or at least according to this survey, they like are things that one associates with liberalism. I mean, they like a lot of the things that liberalism offers. Impartial administration of the law, for example, being one of them, and one can come up with other things. So, on its face, if you look at liberal ideas in the abstract, if they were addressed to the Russian public in a kind of Russian way, one might feel that they would actually gain some traction. It's perhaps because Russian liberals have a tendency not to do that. Again, I noticed that you mentioned in the book, and it was again a passage that I found very interesting. That if we're talking about later, the sort of Soviet liberals, that the people who were active in the liberal movement in the Soviet Union, they were not much interested in people outside their own circle. They were not really engaging with the large mass of the Soviet population, and there is a fundamental mistake. I mean, the Bolsheviks and Putin and people like that, Russian conservatives have seem to have shown much more interest in the Russian population than liberals do.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a lot to that. It has been said that Russians don't actually dislike liberalism; they just dislike liberals. There is some, as you say, statistical evidence which would, suggest that basic ideas of liberalism, like individual freedom and honest, rule of law and so on, are widely held. Yes, but liberals themselves, particularly because of the term liberalism is a sort of a dirty word. It always has been. In the late 19th century, liberalism was kind of a dirty word because it meant you weren't radical enough. It was like you were like weak and feeble, right? Because you were a liberal, not a real revolutionary. And nowadays, liberalism associated with the poverty of the 1990s. So it has a label. It has a label problem, even if people don't. If they really thought about it, wouldn't necessarily dislike what it's meant to stand for. They don't like the label. And the overt Westernism is not helpful in a period when Russian-Western conflict is so extreme. And it has been an important part of Russian liberalism really since its beginning. If you go back again to around 1900, the leader of the Cadet Party, Pavel Milyukov, was a historian, and he was a historian who had what they call a positivist view of history and a historical determinism, but all of history was moving according to laws, and these laws dictated that we all became Western European liberal democracies, and therefore and what isn't is becomes an ought. Because this is true, we ought to be doing this, because it is standing in the way of history is harmful. And you have a very similar belief in the radical reformers of the 1990s who believe with equal fervor that, and I include some quotes from this in the book, that there are absolute rules of economics which apply everywhere, and whether you're Argentina or Germany or Russia, it doesn't matter. The economic policy needs to be the same everywhere, because that is the laws of economics, which is Western free market liberalism as they understood it, which was, I think, not actually very well. And this overt Westernism is problematic because it can be very easily used against them. I mean, I think the Russian state today is very adept at using this against liberals, and therefore discredit liberals, even if not just necessarily discrediting what we would imagine to be the ideas of liberalism, which at least in theory the Russian state still adheres to. Yeah, at least in theory, and you listen to Putin's speeches, he's never said like democracy is bad, we are supporting autocracy against democracy. No, I mean he doesn't say that. And you read denunciations by, for instance, Sergei Lavrov, Foreign Minister of Western foreign policy. He says the problem with rules-based international order is that it's hypocritical. It disobeys all the rules of liberalism. That's not actually an attack on liberalism. Right? It's saying you so-called liberals aren't. So officially, the Russian state has never disclaimed these principles, but it has blackened the names of those who have that label. But
wouldn't the problem then be Well, would you say that the Russian government rejects, will move towards becoming more or less liberal? Because again, a key problem we always go back to this idea of what is the foundation of liberalism. Because Putin has also, at one point, you open up your book with this, stating that the liberal idea has come to an end. But at the same time, you see in Russia, people have their individual freedoms. They like their freedoms. They're not prepared to give them away. But again, you go back to this label and often a more radical interpretation of liberalism, in which you reject the tradition, faith, the state, and I guess collective identities. Now, but again, this is not liberalism. Doesn't necessitate this. Again, this is why earlier on, when I mentioned the late 19th centuries, because you saw the same thing happening then. You had the individuals that were, liberated, if you will, from the communes, from their from faith, from all groups, and they ended up then in the cities. They confronted with oligarchs living in poor conditions. They didn't really have any support system as they did in the past. A lot of this gave the grounds for a lot of the radicalism, which became wind in the sail of socialism. So, to what extent is the core of liberalism not the label, but the actual value of individual freedoms? Is this really under attack? Because I don't really get that impression always in Russia at all, actually. But this is because I wouldn't necessarily see upholding traditions and as contradictory to liberalism. Indeed, we often forget that liberalism in the French Revolution was introduced with nationalism. So you had the understanding often that the rights of the individual was also balanced by the nation, which is the group identity, a nation with a culture, tradition, history, something that unites the people as well. So how would you, beyond the labels of how it's been seen as more maybe treacherous, how would you see liberalism going in Russia today?
Well, I think in terms of you might say core values and institutions, where there has been a change in recent years is particularly since the start of the war in Ukraine. Clearly, there has been some clampdown on political liberty. I think that's quite clear. It's quite dangerous to openly oppose the war. You will likely find yourself in prison if you do that. And before the invasion of Ukraine in February 2002, the state allowed a certain space for the liberal media. It had, what Russians call a roof. So, which is like some sort of degree of protection against the state. I mean, there was, limitations on what they could do, but at the same time, it was, you could, limit what TV Dozhd or Novaya Gazeta newspaper could do, but at the same time, it's clear that you don't close them down, right? They're allowed to exist. And this is coming on from fairly high up, okay? Once the war starts, that all goes. The roof is removed, and the liberal media is that bit which had been allowed to exist as sort of to give the impression that we allow it. Okay, but that was removed, right? So in that sense, I think political liberty has certainly declined in recent years. Economic freedom is a more tricky statement because the Russian state remains and Putin remains officially committed to it, and Putin makes endless statements about how we've got to get bureaucrats off people's backs and stuff like this, and we can't return to the command economy. And then 2 years later he'll make the same speech, which makes it obvious that all the efforts to get bureaucrats off people's backs have failed dismally. And in the meantime, the role of the state in the economy has grown and grown. So there's, the sort of declaratory principle that, we don't want a Soviet economy. We don't want too much state involvement. We realize that, entrepreneurs can do this better than we can. But at the same time, there's, as Harold Macmillan said, events, dear boy. And events have pushed the state into an ever increasing role in the economy, which means that the free market probably is not what would be optimal. And of course, economic sanctions have rendered this inevitable, because once you're under very heavy pressure from foreign economic sanctions, then it really running a free market economy becomes counterproductive. I mean, and probably ruinous. You at that point, the state has to start stepping in and doing things. So in that sense, I think clearly there has been some backtracking. Similarly, in you talk about the conservative family values thing. I mean, there has been some backtracking there too. Previously, the sort of Russian state's view of LGBT things was you can do it as long as you don't be too obvious about it, right? Now they're pushing back even on that to some degree. I think if you talk about core liberal values and institutions, clearly I think that they're not such a strong state now as they were 10 years ago. I think that's fairly clear. Whether they could bounce back again when the war is over.
I was going to say, because this seems like a trend in...
That remains to be seen. Because war has a particular constraining influence. I mean, you can see the same thing in Ukraine. Ukraine is not a liberal free market democracy, right? Because I mean, it's a state which is fighting for its existence in war. It's not going to be. It couldn't be. It would be absurd for it to be. So will it be bounced back once the war happens? I don't know, to be honest.
But this is consistent in Russian history, isn't it? Over the past 200 years, every time Russia opens and have more liberal reforms, they end up in some not because of the reforms, but when they end up with some clash with foreign powers, usually some Western countries, and then they backtrack, they tighten things up, and this is been.
Yes, I think foreign conflict is, and this is not a message Western politicians like to hear, but foreign pressure on Russia is probably the worst thing you can do for Russian liberalism, because inevitably the response of the Russian state to foreign pressure is to clamp down. And as you say, this is a historical pattern, and even histories now of the Great Terror in 1937, 1938 tend to the view that what caused it was Stalin's fear of a coming world war and the need to purge any possible enemies within before the war, so that nothing happened to him similar to what happened to the Tsar in 1917. So it was very much rising international tension, because actually previous to that, Stalin had been pushing hard for his new constitution, and actually was pushing things like multi-candidate elections to party posts, which was, obviously was still going to be controlled, but he was actually moving towards reducing the tension a little bit. And then, tensions start really rising with Germany, and suddenly it's, Great Terror. And similarly, I think the worse our relations have got between the West and Russia in the current day, the worse the condition of Russian liberalism has become and will become. And similarly to the Gorbachev era, liberalism will only go hand in hand with an easing of international tension. There will be, the Russian state will feel an ability to lay off a bit, you might say, when it feels under less international pressure, probably. Right? I can't predict for sure.
This is a point actually that you make in the book, that periods of liberalization in Russia tend to happen during periods of peace. This was true in the 1860s. It was true in the 1980s. We are not in a period of peace. We're in a very, very tense period at the present time. Not as bad as the 1930s, thank goodness. But anyway, we are in a very, very tense time. Hopefully the reaction will not be the same in Russia. It won't be the same in Russia. So
I think as long as the current tension continues, I think prospects of liberalism are very poor. And that's I don't see much way around it. So.
But it does seem to me that looking forward, the conditions for a kind of organic development in some ways have never been better. The population is highly educated. It's become politically quite experienced because we've had relatively open period of political participation in or involvement in Russia now extending quite a long time. You mentioned this very, very significant growth of civil society in Russia, which I myself have come across and which hardly ever gets in the West any recognition. And obviously we hear a lot about NGOs, but the number of NGOs that attract the attention in the West and indeed of the Russian government is very small, the sort of Western ones. There are huge numbers of civil society agencies and things that operate in Russia all the time. If you've watched one of the recent Russian films, I can forget its name, but not by the man the director of Leviathan, but it was another film. You actually see at the end one of the Russian civil society organizations come into play. They do exist. They have never been more numerous or more active. And all of that in the necessary conditions of a stable and economically stable, because there is a lot of economic stability in Russia now, society, could potentially have quite an important effect going forward. And perhaps it might result in a new kind of political forces that pick up and bring forward liberal ideas which are not connected to the West in quite the way
that could be true. Because we don't recognize what you're calling civil society as being civil society, because there's a view that civil society is only civil society if it's liberal pro-Western civil society. And going back to your question about Westernism, I mean you can clearly see in other Eastern European countries what's happening in Georgia now, and what happened in Ukraine in 2014. That there is in what you might call opposition civil society a very firm view that being Western is a sort of civilizational choice, right? And therefore this turns NGOs into fundamentally revolutionary forces. And this is obviously what the Russian government has been trying to prevent and clamp down on. But the result, of course, that leads to interesting debates among scholars of civil society about whether a civil society which is not oppositional is really a civil society. Because if a civil society is not willing to hold the state to account, is it really independent? Can you really call it a civil society? And these are kind of arguments people have. Now, I don't have a clear answer because it's not particularly my field of study, but there is obviously a very large number of NGOs and charitable organizations and so on within Russia who more, as you say, than ever before in history, who do their thing. They are helping local governments very often, and they, if you're a local charity, you need to cooperate with the local government to do anything. So you don't really want to get involved in politics. But because it's so apolitical, will it then create a foundation for a liberal order? I don't know. This was an argument you're making, which was used by sort of moderate liberals in the late 19th century, what they called small deeds liberalism.
Yeah.
And the idea of small deeds liberalism was that by doing this sort of stuff, like in charity work at the local era, you would gradually, little by little, create the seeds of a liberal order. It was then abandoned because people said this isn't working. This is going to take 1,000 felt and years. So you may be right, Alexander, but it may be that this is too slow a process to ever satisfy people who do have the liberal label.
Indeed, so especially the Russian liberals who are never easily satisfied. I was actually thinking of precisely the point you made, because about the Zemstva and the sort of structures that they created around them and they spun around them. But of course, the point is that today's Russia is profoundly different from that of the 19th century. I mean, we're no longer looking at an agrarian peasant society, 80% of the population, much of which is, the social gap between it and the intellectual elite class is enormous. It's a completely different society. Many of these civil society structures, which, as I said, I have come across them personally, do exist. I mean, they actually are formed by precisely the people who benefit from them. I mean, they will be formed by, if we're talking about the war, mothers who want to support the soldiers at the front, or people who want to help children through schools, that sort of thing, their own children. In other words, this is this is closer to a civil society such as we perhaps know in our own societies in the West than the kind of civil societies that existed in Russia in the late 19th century, when, as I said, it was more an elite trying to.
The issue then, Alexander, is whether it's a liberal civil society, or illiberal civil society. So, I mean, the critics say illiberal civil society. Now, and certainly, go back to the labels. The people who consider themselves liberals, wouldn't consider it an event. So then you'd have to come down to question and we in the West would certainly never recognize it as such.
No, because
so we will never, even if you decide, it will never be recognized as the true liberalism by anyone over here.
I mean, the reason I bring this up is precisely because, again, going back to that sociological survey, which I accept is, I mean, it's, you can't perhaps place too much on it, and it's not even clear cut, but it does suggest that within wider Russian society, the people who are involved in these particular civil society type movements, many ideas that we personally associate with liberalism or are actually popular. And one assumes that they are popular, especially with the people who are involved in this kind of thing. I mean, I think this is where perhaps we need to be very careful in the West, in that we shouldn't welcome developments in another society because they are, they're seen as sympathetic to us in the West. I think that's where I think we go often very wrong. If things develop within Russia in this kind of way, civil society structures are created and political structures are created and economic ones, and there are now lots of people who run their own businesses in Russia. Again, I've come across them. There are lots of private businesses in Russia. There are organized labor groups. There are all kinds of people who think and talk about all of these things. And what I'm saying is they need to be given time to breathe. If they are, both obviously internally by the Russian state, but also by us. And if we perhaps do slacken off the pressure, exactly as Glenn was saying, then perhaps they will start to breathe, and we could find ourselves seeing a Russia evolve, which may not be quite the liberal place that we would like it to be, but which would perhaps have some of those liberal accents that already seem to exist there. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I think you're probably right, but of course the condition of that is a degree of détente, essentially.
Yes. Well, yes. which is perhaps unsurprisingly. I mean, I think that is right. And well, I mean, it's what I would like to see anyway, putting aside anything else. But it would be better for us, and it would be better for them.
Yes,
But that's my own view.
Peace is, how can I put it? Peace is good for everybody. So
yes.
Unfortunately, I think we have an attitude that you can only achieve our maximalist, but we won't. We want maximalist goals, and that maximalist goals can only be achieved by political and economic and some degree also now military pressure, which I don't actually think is actually correct. Now, I mean, at this point, people obviously, of course, accuse me of being an appeaser or something, but historically, appeasement has often worked, actually.
Well, I would say,
and as we said, peace is the condition of liberalism. Essentially, exactly. It requires it.
Exactly. I mean, I would say the diametric opposite is not appeasement. It's acting in long-term self-interest, amongst other things.
Yeah, I mean, if you want states which are in conflict, will not be liberal.
No,
because conflict requires mobilization of society.
Yes,
which therefore inevitably leads you in a illiberal direction. Whereas peace will allow the underlying, as you say, liberal attitudes of people to greater opportunity to flourish, because also the state finds it less threatening. At that point.
I'm just going to make one very last point, which is the other thing that I found very interesting about the book is that I'd always assumed, very lazily, that liberals in Russia had always been adherents of laissez-faire free market economics. It turns out that is not the case at all. And again, perhaps we in the West have an over-high expectation that the only kind of liberals that make sense to us are liberals who do have those types of views. And that might be rather unhelpful. And it may also be a good thing if people in Russia who have liberal views rediscover the fact that there has been a diversity of economic views, economic perspectives on how economics in their own country can be organized, including from people who seem to have had, well, more social democratic views than strictly, pure classical liberalism, liberal ones. And given, going back to that survey, I was interested to see that if we were talking about young people, they seem to say that social democracy, well, we don't know what they mean by that, but that seems to be their most popular way forward.
Yeah, well, certainly I think radical laissez-faire has been very, I mean, I personally am quite free market oriented, but in a Russian context, that's a no-starter. It's a non-starter now simply because of the experience in the 1990s. It's thoroughly discredited, and there's an interesting book by a Russian Tatar emigre. I think she's now at Oxford University or something. I can't remember her exact name. It's called The Red Mirror, I think. And she says, Russian liberalism will never get anywhere until this negative perception of the 1990s goes away. But that's kind of a no-hoper because it's not going to go away. So rather than changing the perception of the 1990s, you probably need to change for liberalism, right? Because that free market model is just it's a non-starter. Even though, of course, even within the Russian state, there are still those who ideally would like to go back to it. But so there are some people who actually regard, conservatives who regard the Russian state as a bastion of Evo neoliberalism.
I've come across them many times.
The head of the central bank and others being prime examples. But yes, you're right. I mean, historically speaking, laissez-faire economics have not been desperately strong in Russian liberalism, except for that brief period in the early 1990s.
Well, we seem to have run out of time. I would just like to point out, I very much agree on this idea that I think we might be doing a disservice to Russian liberalism by trying to guide it too extensively, because I think often, much like what you discussed with civil society, it has a tendency, instead of being one other center of power, to reduce the concentration of power in the state as a balance. In the West, we have often an incentive to maybe embrace or advocate for a very anti-government liberalism in Russia, simply because we have a very adversarial relationship. But I think George Kennan pointed out in the 90s, we should let the Russians be Russians, something along those lines. I think it has to be more organic, to be more moderate. For the liberals to find their position inside the political system, because at the moment they seem too revolutionaries. This idea of overthrowing the state as a condition to advance liberalism. Of course, the incrementalism is has a different challenge to it, but I think this this bad label is not just the 1990s, something stuck with them. It has been quite consistent, and I think it's this revolutionary streak, this very anti-government approach. Doesn't mean that government shouldn't be criticized or balanced, but again, this whole day of uprooting the past and doing something completely different, I think incrementalism would be a much more healthy path for it. Anyway, do any of you have any final comments before we wrap up?
I just to urge people to read Paul Robinson's book, which I have to say I found extremely interesting. It complements your conservatism book very well, if I may say, and I think the two should be read together. And just to also quickly say, it was very interesting to see how liberalism and conservatism in Russia can overlap sometimes. So that, someone like Karamzin, people say sometimes he's a liberal, even though most people think he's a conservative. So things of this kind. I mean, it makes you understand an awful lot about Russia, which I didn't understand before or see. So I generally would strongly say people should read this book if they really want to understand both the Russia that was and the Russia that is being a product of the Russia that was, obviously.
Well, thank you, Alexander.
Yeah, I very much agree. If you order, when you order the book Russian Liberalism by Professor Robinson, get the Russian conservatism at the same time. I noticed the same theme, the concepts, the time periods. It's very, very, very much complement each other. So both great books. So, anyways, thank you both for coming on, and anyone for listening. Thank you.